us live. I'm gonna be checking as well.
I see it. All right.
Oh yeah, we're live.
All right. I'm gonna play us some music. We'll maybe get started and we'll give folks 5-ish minutes to join.
I got this feeling
We'll just hang out for
inside my
now.
bones.
Tell us where you're
It goes
from
electric
in the
wavy
chat.
when I turn it
Hello.
on.
Oh, I see Wilson.
Off from my city, off from my
There are
home.
people here. Hey everybody.
Flying up no ceiling
Where are
when
you?
making our
Bonjour.
sound. I got that sunshine in my pocket, got that good soul in my
I'm
feet.
currently in Normandy, France, everyone. I'll write in the chat.
Drops. Ooh, I can't take
Late
my
at
eyes
night
off
in
it,
Normandy,
moving so
France.
phenomenally. Come on, like
I
the
see
way
the
we rock it,
Pennsylvania.
so don't stop.
Pennsylvaniaite.
Under the
Oh, hey, it's Connor. Hey, Connor from
everything
Boston.
goes. Nowhere to hide when
Some of
the
our
getting
teachers here.
close. When we
Mary.
move, well, you already know.
Dylan.
Nothing I can see but you when you dance, dance, dance. Feel a good creeping up on you, so just dance, dance, dance. Come on. All those things
Yeah,
I
nice to
should
meet
do,
you all
but
too.
you
Tell us
dance,
where you're
dance,
from.
dance. Ain't
But
nobody
one of my
nothing,
favorite
so
things
keep
to know
dancing.
is how long your streak is. So tell us how long your
So
streak
just
is.
dance, dance, dance.
Tell us what you're learning. It's I'm from Honduras. Special place in my heart.
Something magical.
Also,
It's in the
tell us
air,
what
it's in
language
my
you forgot,
blood, it's
because
rushing
that's what we're
on.
going to talk about
Don't
tonight.
need no reason.
I
Don't be
personally have
control.
forgotten French.
I fly
I
so
took it in
high,
high
no
school.
ceiling when
I
I'm
took it
in
in
my zone.
college.
'Cause I got
I don't
that
remember
sunshine
it.
in my
I'm trying
pocket,
really
got
hard to
that good
remember.
soul in my feet. I feel that hot blood in my body when it drops. Ooh, I can't take my eyes off it, moving so phenomenally.
Syria,
Come on, like the way we rock it. So
Hi,
don't stop.
everyone.
Under the lights, when
Hope, have you ever
everything
forgotten a language?
goes.
Oh, yeah. My
Oh, yeah.
Latin is bad. Like, I studied Latin and I don't remember many words.
It's hard because Latin, you can't really like immerse yourself, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, no, I really need to go back and reread some of the classics, kind of reread the Aeneid, like I did back in high school.
That seems right.
I forgot a lot of my sign language. I took a year of sign language in college, but I've forgotten a lot. So
Oh,
still
interesting.
remember the alphabet though.
Yeah.
Good finger spell.
Yeah, some
Important
things don't leave you, right? Some things you just
Mhm.
hold on to.
And especially that, I think there's something to do with like, the physical sense of moving my fingers, right? That and just having that, and it's ingrained in my brain.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, shall we
Right,
get
I
started?
think, yeah, I think let's go ahead and roll. Let's do it.
Right,
Go
yeah.
ahead, Bridget.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. My name is Bridget with the Duolingo for Schools team. I'm here with Tracy and Hope. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about the science of, remembering and forgetting language. So I'm really excited to know a little bit more. Tracy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Tracy, also on the Duolingo for Schools team, former teacher and administrator, and just really love the community of teachers at Duolingo. I see some of you in the chat, and just really excited to be here with our friend Hope. Hope, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So really nice to meet you all. My name is Hope. I am a curriculum designer at Duolingo and also a former teacher. I taught Russian for a number of years while I was getting my graduate degree, where I studied second language acquisition. Yeah, I missed the classroom. I really enjoyed it, but I really love my job at Duolingo because I still get to work with curricula. I still get to help design kind of language courses and all of that. So it's a lot of fun. Yeah, so I taught Russian, and while I was studying, I also studied a fair amount about memory. That kind of, I worked with an advisor whose specialty was in memory, and specifically kind of remembering and forgetting. And so I did a little bit of research, nothing big, but some research into the science of kind of forgetting languages, along with the science of learning languages.
Awesome. And I should also state that I'm also a former teacher and also very excited to be able to connect with educators in my role with Duolingo for Schools. But if you're watching this, if you're listening to this conversation, you know it's about forgetting and then remembering language. And there may be some folks out there who feel like they've just forgotten a lot of information about language over the past month or two. But there may be others like Tracy, who's told me that she's forgotten French from over 2 decades ago. So Hope, I was wondering, is this information that you're going to discuss today relevant to one of those groups more than another? Or will what you have to tell us apply no matter how much we've forgotten and when we forget it?
Yeah. So this information is really relevant regardless of when you have stopped learning and when you've started forgetting, right? That kind of when we stop engaging with a language, there's a fairly sharp curve of forgetting where you forget most of kind of like what you forget, what you're going to forget. You forget right at the beginning, right? So within the first couple of months is when you do most of your forgetting. And then after that point, it kind of levels off. So what that means, therefore, is that, this is applicable for those who maybe over summer break or kind of after a couple of months have forgotten stuff. And it's also relevant to those who maybe haven't touched their language in a decade or more, that kind of like you still have similar levels of remembering, just kind of buried in your brain.
Got it. Got it. And what about the age of the learner? Would you say that that makes a difference at all?
So that's actually kind of exciting because the age of the learner does make a difference to a certain extent when you're learning a language for the first time, right? That studies have shown that older learners tend to kind of be a little bit slower to learn. They can still absolutely learn, but frequently, it's a slightly slower process to form new knowledge. But recovering knowledge, we actually don't see any age effects whatsoever. So essentially, kind of whether you are a younger learner or an older learner, the process of language recovery is equally robust and equally strong, which is great news for those of us who, might be a little, who are slightly older learners. Yes.
Absolutely. That is very great news to know that it doesn't matter what age you are when you're remembering language later on. Really, really cool. So let's get to it a little bit. Would you say that we forget languages? Do we absolutely forget what we've learned in the past?
So we do not absolutely forget much. Generally, kind of language, like with a lot of other information, once it has been stored in your long-term memory, it's still there, right? You probably kind of can feel this whenever you're trying to remember something that you've forgotten. The sensation of trying to remember is not one of trying to sort of like create new knowledge, right? It's the process of trying to re-access knowledge that you already have. So essentially, that is what remembering is, and that is what relearning is taking this knowledge where essentially your access to it has been blocked through memory decay and reestablishing access. So reestablishing access, kind of like forming those links again so that once again, you can find the information in your brain. It's a lot easier than kind of building this knowledge in access, that goes a lot quicker. So yeah, it's basically to kind of sum up, the knowledge that you have of a language is never totally gone. Instead, kind of remembering involves sort of finding those lost bridges, rebuilding those bridges so that you can access it again.
Got it. So you've talked about reaccessing language. So how would we go about reaccessing this language? How could we, reform those bridges to this lost, forgotten language?
Yeah. So you basically rebuild those bridges in a similar way to how you kind of built them in the first place, right? Of kind of engaging with the language, engaging with kind of just use of the language. However, there are certain aspects of the language that when you're trying to rebuild this access that you should focus on more, right? So generally speaking, grammatical knowledge doesn't actually decay that much over time. Is what's been found. So a lot of the time, sort of your knowledge of the grammar, even in a language that you've forgotten, your knowledge of the grammar is often still there. What you've generally lost access to is vocabulary. So studies have found that it's vocabulary that really decays. Your knowledge of the vocabulary really decays. And so, this of course is very frustrating because without vocabulary, you're not able to say anything, right? But it does mean that you also have a very specific way of going about it when you go to relearn a language is you just focus on recovering that lost vocabulary. And that's basically the best way to go about it.
Very interesting. And so what about, is there any research that you've read about sounds and about maybe accents and how that comes into play with language?
Yeah, so kind of to a certain extent, kind of sound discrimination is a slightly tricky category, right? So there has been research that kind of when people have lost their knowledge of like being able to tell two sounds apart, right? Maybe earlier in life, they had kind of lost this ability, like they had this ability and then over time they had lost it. That's a little harder to recover and that takes serious retraining. So, kind of as an English speaker, I have trouble kind of like telling the contrast between like an aspirated p and an unaspirated p, right? Which is a distinction that exists in some languages. So, I don't have a very good way of doing that, and kind of people who have lost that also, it's pretty hard to reestablish that link. Instead they kind of have to relearn it. So that's kind of one slightly discouraging thing, but a lot of other stuff can be recovered pretty easily.
Awesome. Shall we take a pause and take any questions from the audience? Tracy, do you see any questions at all, or do you have a question yourself?
Well, we might be having some minor technical difficulties. So I don't see any audience questions, but I have a couple of questions on my own. So maybe if people are watching later, they'll have the same ones. So here's my question, Hope. As a former educator, I read a lot and worked a lot with like spaced repetition. And so I'm curious how the ideas for like building memories, that for me feels like something to build memories in the first place, right? Like spaced repetition helps you to remember, but it's like when you're forming memories for the first time. So I'm curious how like ideas like spaced repetition or some of the things that we integrate into lessons or curricula interplay or interact with the ideas that you've brought up so far.
Yeah, so it's actually it's interesting that you bring that up because one of the original kind of researchers, Ebbinghaus, who kind of sort of realized that relearning was easier. He was also one of the people who worked on spaced repetition and kind of was one of the first people who really kind of thought about the role of spaced repetition in learning. So yeah, but yes, so spaced repetition is kind of very, very relevant for kind of language learning and language retention, as well as language recovery. That, spaced repetition is essentially re-accessing information at strategic times. So it's actually kind of very similar, like essentially what you're doing in spaced repetition is almost the same thing that you're doing in language relearning, where you kind of like, you learn something and then you have that memory decay and then you relearn it and then you have that memory decay and then you relearn it and you have that memory decay. And each time you relearn it, that kind of memory decay is a little bit slower, is what has been found. So, that's why we use spaced repetition on Duolingo, right? Is that kind of, it's a really good tool for building up more robust kind of knowledge that's more resistant to forgetting. Because it sort of, and it acts in a very similar way to relearning in general, where you're kind of like essentially building those bridges to your knowledge to be so robust that they crumble much more slowly over time. And that's what relearning does.
It's like, it reminds me of like growth mindset and connecting of neurons. And the more you do things, the stronger you get at them.
Exactly. Yeah. Kind of, that when two things, like when you make kind of like this memory fire, right? Then it gets wired. That kind of like you're building these neural links to be really robust and kind of, making it so that your brain is used to traveling down those same pathways.
Very cool. So
That's very cool.
here's another question then. How, if at all, does this relate to the fact that I cannot for the life of me remember where I put my keys?
Yeah, so this is kind of all knowledge kind of is subject to forgetting, right? And all knowledge is subject to relearning. So we talk about it in particular with reference to language, right? Because kind of like language is, it's such complex knowledge that we can kind of, there's so much to forget and so much to relearn that, kind of the relearning paradigms, the savings paradigm as it's called, is really useful for language. But you can also apply it for kind of simpler information like where you put your keys, right? Which is why kind of you get advised, if you're somebody who loses your keys a lot of the time, to put them in the same place again and again. It's sort of a form of spaced repetition, essentially, where kind of like every time you rediscover your keys in that same place, it builds this memory link. It makes those neurons stronger and stronger until finally, like, you have kind of like ingrained in your brain this pattern of keys go there. I put them down there. I pick them up there. It's just kind of, it's just a simpler form of information that you can train yourself on.
So if I was, prone to forgetting the name of a person that I just met, then I would want to repeat their name maybe, or like think about them in 5 minutes and think about them in, got it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It doesn't do much good to just kind of like repeat constantly, right? Because that doesn't actually strengthen your kind of like that ability to retrieve the information. But if you can kind of like learn their name, and then relearn their name a little bit later, and then even a little bit later still learn it again, that's what teaches you kind of like that pattern of retrieving this information.
So interesting.
It's really
Okay, this is my last question is back to language. So we're getting ready to go on vacation. And my partner knew German pretty well at one point, and insists that he doesn't know it that well anymore. And we're going to go to Germany, and I will rely upon him to get us around in German. So what's the best way to get vocabulary back?
Yeah. So you can definitely engage with kind of relearning the language in the way that you learned it in the first place, right? So, he might, for example, kind of like hop on Duolingo, take the German course, which I can highly recommend because I worked on it. And
he is, in fact. I have, obviously he is. So yes, but yes,
right,
thank you for that course. So.
And so kind of what you would do is, if you're relearning something rather than learning it from like in the first place, right? You would kind of maybe let yourself move a little faster than you would have otherwise. So if you're doing Duolingo, do some test outs, kind of like start from the beginning. But if you're finding, okay, this is coming back to me really quickly, then push yourself faster, push yourself a little bit further. So that's one strategy. As I mentioned, kind of vocabulary is what you really want to focus on. So you can also do dedicated study of vocabulary alone. And there's some great resources for that. For example, most languages have something that's generally called a learner's dictionary or a frequency dictionary, which lists all the words of a language basically in the order of frequency. So I like to do that whenever I'm trying to kind of recover vocab in something. Is I go through and I sort of look at the most frequent words, and I just kind of move down until I start hitting words I don't know. And then I make flashcards. I'm a flashcards person for learning vocab. So, I make those physical flashcards and I just kind of drill myself on them. And then when that memory link is reestablished, I set that card aside, and then I move on to kind of like the other kind of vocabulary that I need to relearn.
Cool. That's all my questions.
I agree with the flashcards. There's something about, again, about that physical like brain link,
Mm.
right? Manually just writing. I mean, there's been research done about that, of course, too. But I have a question. So, as you know, Hope, Tracy and I work closely with educators using Duolingo for Schools specifically, and it's back to school season, right? Can you talk a little bit about what kind of application there is for back to school in classrooms specifically?
Yeah, so there are a lot of applications here, right? Like kind of forgetting and relearning are very, very important at back to school time. Because as we like kind of as I mentioned, that forgetting curve where kind of like you forget information fast at the beginning, that's very, very relevant for kind of students who have been away from the classroom for a couple of months, is that they will have done a lot of forgetting in those couple of months. So, you know, kind of very canny students, very savvy students will often do a little bit, you know, they'll open the books a couple of weeks before the end of, you know, or the start of the new semester, right? And they'll kind of work to recover what they've forgotten. But maybe students who are a little bit less adept in learning strategies, they might not, right? They might not know that they should do that. And so a lot of the time, I'm sure the teachers in the audience know all about this, that kind of like when students come back from summer break, there's often a real kind of achievement gap in terms of those who have kind of reviewed and those who haven't. So, you know, what I would recommend to all language teachers out there is, you know, kind of build this understanding that relearning can and will happen, build it into your courses, right? You know, it's a really, really good thing to do, to take a little while at the beginning of the semester to, you know, assign homeworks, to kind of take class time to really focus on rebuilding, reaccessing that previous language knowledge, especially the vocabulary. Because, you know, that will do a lot to narrow some of those kind of gaps between like some of the more prepared and some of the less prepared students, so that it doesn't just get worse over the course of the semester. Because there's nothing more heartbreaking than a student who falls behind on day one and, you know, later on in the semester is even further behind.
Absolutely. Yep. So, in short, just be able
To
to
narrow some of those
spend a little
kind of
time
gaps
to,
between like some of the more prepared and some of the less
to,
prepared students.
sorry, I'm hearing a little, I don't know if anyone's hearing that on my end.
I was hearing it too, but
Yeah, a little bit of like, I don't know if there might be a lag. There might be a lag there that,
a little bit of lag.
but so essentially just being able to build in some time for review and not focus on any new material in the beginning of the year. Absolutely.
Definitely.
I know I always try to do that for my students going back in the beginning of the year, and you're absolutely right. Definitely don't want to start off, you know, discouraged or feeling nervous. And actually, I remember a lot of my students did feel really anxious and frustrated by the language lost over the summer, right? So what would you say specifically to students, for example, who may be discouraged, who may be feeling a little anxious by their loss of language, either whether or not it's, you know, over the summer, if it's been 2 decades, like in Tracy's case, what are some ways that we could make them feel a little better about the process?
Definitely. So, I mean, the first thing to kind of, if you are a student who's forgotten, or if you're a teacher, you know, kind of like it's very important to remember this is a natural process. There's nothing wrong with you for having forgotten, and you should not shame yourself for maybe having let some stuff slip over the summer. And, you know, teachers, I would say, you know, kind of pass that message on to students as well, right? That kind of like the fact that you have forgotten does not reflect poorly on you. It just means that you have a human brain. And for the students, yeah, kind of like take that time, maybe a couple of days before the start of the semester, maybe kind of during those first days of the semester, like take the time to really work to recover your language, that it's not a lost cause. You know, it's not something where, well, there's no point to it because you've lost everything, that, you know, you've forgotten it, but it is not gone, right? So you can recover it. The work of the past year before you went off for summer was not a waste. You just need to put in the time to make sure that you get it back, and it'll go so much faster than it went when you were learning it in the first place.
Love that. Love that positive mindset. It will come back. Don't worry. It won't be as hard as it was to learn it in the first place, right?
Yeah, and once
Um,
it's back, like your knowledge will be all the more solid too.
100%. You're really reinforcing
Mhm.
those connections in your brain, right? 100%. So this is a really interesting topic. And I was wondering, as you went through your research, is there anything else that was especially intriguing that you could share with us?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to share with you a study. This one was actually done by my advisor, Ludmila Sorin, and I love this study. Basically, what happened was that she had kind of somebody who had approached her who had been adopted, spoken another language in her childhood, but she didn't know what language she had spoken. She didn't know where she came from, but she remembered just like a couple of words, like some sounds, and she thought maybe it's a Slavic language. And so what happened was this researcher worked with her to kind of essentially use this process of relearning to compare, like, could she relearn languages or words from a certain language faster than she could learn others? Because if she could move faster, that was an indication that she wasn't learning them from scratch, she was relearning them. And so she actually used this system to determine kind of like essentially what language this person had spoken in her childhood. So I just thought that was just so cool, kind of just from a perspective of how robust this is, like how powerful this relearning is, and also just from a human element, right? Just
Yeah,
kind of from a
absolutely.
human perspective, like
Yeah,
knowing somebody was able to sort of recover a link to their sort of childhood. It's just really lovely. Yeah.
that is, wow, really cool. Well, thank you so much, Hope. Thank you for meeting with us. I think we've had a little technical difficulties, so I'm so sorry to our audience members. This is recorded though, so that's a positive. But I do want to say that we're doing a lot of these speaker series on our educators network. So I want to invite any world language teachers that may be in the audience, if you're able to, or if you're watching the recording, to check us out there. And my colleague Trace is actually going to add the link to the chat now. So thank you so much, though, Hope. This has been, like I mentioned before, like very interesting conversation. Tracy, I really hope that you could take this information, bring it back to Todd, and get ready for your trip to Germany, right?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, can I ask one more question?
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like you addressed this, but I'm just curious, how much do you, as you're thinking about like building a curriculum in Duolingo, I know we talked about spaced repetition. Are there like other things that you specifically do in your work at Duolingo that like try to emphasize this like building of memory aspect of learning?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that we do in kind of our curricula is, kind of like we obviously kind of, in the system itself, kind of automatically it is kind of like, spaced repetition is built into it. But we curriculum designers also make sure that kind of we are revisiting topics at really strategic times. So kind of as we're building our courses, you'll notice that there are sometimes like kind of units that are on similar topics. And maybe if you're very perceptive, you'll also know, or, if you're a teacher who has had access to kind of the learning objectives and you can kind of see the topics that are being covered, you can see that we kind of spiral around and revisit kind of grammatical topics as well, with kind of increasing levels of complexity. And so we do that very deliberately to make sure that kind of like our learners keep kind of like coming back to those hard concepts, kind of coming back to the vocabulary that they've already encountered, those grammatical concepts that need reinforcement. And we do that at strategic times to really make sure that we're building up that all the knowledge, kind of using sort of these kind of revisiting techniques, this repetition. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about that. I love curriculum design. I love kind of like all the fun stuff we do in our curricula.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I do feel as if people don't realize how much research has gone into Duolingo in our curriculum, right? And how much work we really focus on. It's not just, we're not just winging it, right?
No, like my team and I, we are intense about our curriculum design. Like we don't let each other kind of slide on, maybe we could just kind of like let this go. No, like we are very, very stringent.
I think, yeah. And speaking of that, I know if you're interested, if you love this talk and you could listen to it over and over, this will also be a blog post, I believe, in
Yes.
the beginning of September. So look forward to that. But also the Duolingo blog has so much interesting information from our learning curriculum specialists, especially. We have the Duolingo for Schools team puts blog posts out, but they're nothing in comparison with some of the interesting linguistic stuff that Hope's team puts out. So if you haven't checked out the Duolingo blog,
the blog
go
is great
there.
because that's where we get a chance to be like properly nerdy, like kind of like, we've somebody at some point decided like, okay, the learning folks can become just giant nerds on the blog. So go check it out. There's some fun stuff there.
It's excellent.
Properly nerdy. Yes, absolutely. Love that. Perfect. Well, thank you so much to Hope. Tracy, thank you for being here. Amazing discussion. I hope this is recorded despite the
think we're good.
absolutely recorded. So.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye,
Hope.
everybody.